Well, hello there, my true crime devotees. I'm Casey, and this is Let's Tell Their Story. In the United States alone, over the past 40 years, over 200,000 cases have gone unsolved. Whether that be missing persons, unsolved murders, or unsolved suspicious deaths, I'm here to tell you the stories about the cases that were never solved. I hope I can bring light to these cold cases that just sit and collect dust. I go through every case with as much research as I possibly can and give you the knowledge that I was able to find. So grab your warmest blanket, find a comfy spot to relax, and let me tell you a story. If you're doing chores like washing dishes, doing laundry, driving, or even if you're at work, it's okay. You guys can listen too. Story time. Before I begin today's story, I have a little announcement that I intend to give you at the end of the story. So keep listening for a bit after the final question so you get the information or the announcement I want to give. Dorothy Harriet Camille Arnold was born July 1st, 1885 to Francis R. Arnold and Mary Martha Parks Arnold in New York. Francis, his parents were English passengers on the Mayflower, that big ship that had the Pilgrims on it. Mary Martha Parks, she was from Montreal, Quebec, Canada. Dorothy was the second of Francis and Mary's 4 children. John being born December of 1884. I know, those dates don't add up for me either. 3 years later, along came Dan, and then in 1891, the baby, Marjorie, made her appearance. Francis was a very educated man. He had graduated from Harvard University, to which he was the senior partner of F.R. Arnold and Company. And that company, it imported fancy goods. Basically, they imported perfumes from Europe and stuff. Dorothy's Aunt Harriet was married to Supreme Court Justice Rufus W. Peckman. Peckman served from 1895 to 1909 and is the most recent Democratic nominee approved by a Republican Senate. That's over 100 years ago, and he's the most recent? Wow. So with Dorothy having what could have been known as a prominent elite family, and with that kind of social standing, the Arnold family was on the social register list. I was wondering too, what is the social register list, you ask? Well, here's the answer. It's a semi-annual publication of the U.S.'s that lists those of high society with, air quotes, old money. And I couldn't believe this, but the social registry list, it still exists today. Isn't that crazy? In Dorothy's younger years, she attended the Vetlin School for Girls in New York and then was allowed the ability to continue her education. She majored in literature and language at the Bryn Mawr College in Pennsylvania. Dorothy had an inspiring dream to become an author. In 1910, she began her attempts by submitting a short story to McClure's magazine, only to have it rejected. And instead of Dorothy's friends and family being supportive of her, they made Dorothy feel worse about her rejection by teasing her about it. But Dorothy wasn't going to let them keep her down. In November of that year, she sent off another short story to McClure's magazine called The Poinsettia and the Flame. Sadly, though, this story would also be rejected by the magazine, and the rejection of The Poinsettia and the Flame, Dorothy was devastated and embarrassed, but she was a writer, and that's what she was going to do. After her second rejection, she asked her father, Francis, if she could get her own apartment in Greenwich Village where she could focus on her writing. Francis wasn't having it, and he forbade her from moving out of the family home. He told her, and I quote, "A good writer can write anywhere." Dorothy continued to write, but was finding no success in her attempts. A little side note here, I write myself, and a quiet place to write sometimes is better than just being a good writer being able to write anywhere. I do disagree with Francis on this one. I've caught myself trying to type or old-fashioned pen and paper, and if I start having a conversation with someone else, I've been known to write or type the conversation I'm having with that person rather than what I'm actually working on. But enough about me. Let's get back to Dorothy. So Dorothy's first rejection and the aftermath from her friends and family, she ended up renting a post office box to receive anything from magazines or publishing houses that she would send her stories off to, just to not have the mocking of her family when she received the rejection letters. So now that we have some background on Dorothy and her family, we can get on to the events to why Dorothy even has a story here. Remember that baby sister Marjorie? Well, now she's roughly 19 years old. And she would be having her debutante party. If you don't know what that is, it's okay. It's basically a fancy party for the high society elite to showcase their daughters to marry them off. Which kind of made me wonder why Dorothy hadn't been married off, since she was quite a bit older than Marjorie. Wait, I actually do know. But don't worry, I will get to there in due time. So, on December 12th, 1910, Dorothy told her mother, Mary, she planned to go shopping for a new dress for Marjorie's debutante. Mary offered to go with her, but Dorothy was like, nah, Ma, I'm good. If I find something suitable, I'll call and let you know. So around 11 a.m., Dorothy left the Arnold family home for her day of shopping with between $25 and $30 in cash. I know it doesn't sound like a whole lot, but that's like having between $800 and $950 in today's money. So she must have been looking for a pretty fancy dress. Obviously, she would have been. Her first stop that day was at Park and Tilford, a corner store on the corner of 5th Avenue and 59th Street, where she purchased a half-pound of chocolates that she ended up charging to her account, and she charged those around 12 p.m. She left Park and Tilford, and when she left there, she had placed the half pound of chocolate in her muff. So a muff is basically a fancy hand warmer. It's similar to what like football players use in the winter months, especially the quarterbacks when they're coming onto the field. They've got their hands shoved in that little thing. They're warming it up and whatnot. Well, Dorothy's muff was basically the same concept, only it was had a fancy fur look to it. And she was headed to Brentano's, which was about 1.5 miles away, or 22 blocks. And when she got to Brentano's, she had bought an Emily Kelvin Blake book of humorous essays called Engaged Girl Sketches. So Dorothy ended up leaving Brentano's around 2. And when she left there, she ran into her friend Gladys King, and they spoke briefly about Marjorie's upcoming debutante. I'm guessing Gladys must have been from high society too, because I'm assuming Gladys would have been going to this debutante. But their meeting was short, since Gladys ended up having to excuse herself from their bumping, I guess you could say. She had lunch plans with her own mother at the Waldorf Astoria, and Dorothy told Gladys that she was headed back home and was going to walk through Central Park. So Gladys turned back around and waved goodbye for a second time, like girls do. They turn around and, oh, I don't want to go yet, bye, and just keep kind of walking backwards. Hopefully they don't trip. But Dorothy, obviously she never found a suitable enough dress that day, because there's no record of her buying the dress for the debutante when she went shopping that day. Later that evening, the Arnold family started to sit down to eat dinner, but Dorothy wasn't joining this night, which was very unlike Dorothy to miss a meal with her family without informing them that she wouldn't be joining. Just after midnight on the 13th, one of Dorothy's friends, Elsie Henry, phoned the Arnold home to see if Dorothy was home yet, Dorothy's mother, Mary, had answered the phone, and when Elsie asked to speak to Dorothy, Mary hesitated. She was probably thinking, who do I tell her? What do I tell her? I don't want to tell her she's not here. So she thought up a quick lie, and she told her that Dorothy had indeed made it home, but she had gone to bed with a headache. Although Dorothy still hadn't been heard or seen by anyone since Gladys had seen her just before 2 on the 12th. On the morning of the 13th, Frances contacted a family friend that also happened to be a lawyer. His name was John S. Keith, about his daughter's disappearance. He didn't want to get the authorities involved yet because in 1909, another prominent family from the Upper East Siders had reported their 13-year-old daughter, Adele Boaz, missing from Central Park. She was later found in Boston as she had just ran away, and the Boaz family, they were shamed and scandalized in the papers afterwards because the papers had nothing better to do in that time. So with the Arnold family also being of high society, Frances didn't want the media attention with the possibility of having the same social embarrassment that the Boaz family endured. That day, when Keith arrived at the Arnold family home, he searched Dorothy's room, where he didn't really see anything of disarray. Her personal belongings were still in her room. However, he did come across some burned papers in the fireplace, and they were assumed to be the rejection letters from the magazine and probably from the second story that Dorothy sent to McClure's magazine. You know, the story, The Poinsettia and the Flame. It could have even been as much as the story. And then there was personal letters with foreign postmarks on her desk, along with 2 folders for transatlantic ocean liners. Keith continued his search for Dorothy over the next few weeks, checking the usual places like morgues, hospitals, and jails in New York, Boston, and Philadelphia. With his searches, he was unable to find any sign of Dorothy. She pretty much, as of right now, she's just vanished. Since Keith was getting nowhere on his own, he suggested to the family that they should hire Pinkerton, a private security guard and detective agency, which the family did do. Pinkerton started their search efforts going over everything that Keith had already done and found the same results. Postmarked foreign letters, the folders. They even went as far as asking Dorothy's former college classmates about her whereabouts, but none of them had seen her. Pinkerton started to theorize that Dorothy had just took off and got married to some European man, but searches of marriage records didn't show her name on anything. Then they sent agents out to the ocean liners that were coming into New York. There were a lot of women that matched Dorothy's physical description, but none of them were Dorothy. When Keith and Pinkerton were unable to find Dorothy on their own, they had to convince Frances to do the one thing he did not want to do, and he had to contact the NYPD, which he reluctantly did. And you want to know what the NYPD did? And this is so frustrating, especially with the more I'm reading into these older cases, these PDs, they just didn't want to do any damn work. It's really frustrating. But they told Frances to hold a press conference to get as much publicity as possible. Frances, obviously, he didn't want to do this. He was a man of status, and he was not going to be made a fool of like the Boaz family. But on January 25th, 1911, a little after 2 months after the last sighting of Dorothy, Frances agreed to hold the press conference. So at Francis's New York City office, he informed reporters of his daughter's disappearance and that an award of $1,000 for any information was being given out there about any of Dorothy's whereabouts. So that's a little over $30,000 in today's money. You notice I keep referencing the difference between the money from way back when to what it's equivalent to now. Well, there's a reason I do that, and it's for the simple fact that you can get an idea of, we hear one number, but then with inflation, it gives a stronger vision of reality when you say $1,000 is equivalent to $30,000 113 years later. So back to Dorothy. Reporters do what they do, and asked Francis if Dorothy may have ran off with a man and he didn't allow his daughter to date. And his response was, "I would have been glad to see her associate more with young men than she did, especially young men with brains and position. One whose profession or business would keep him occupied. I don't approve of young men who have nothing to do." He answered this way because he was furious with the questioning, and he felt that he was being made a mockery of. Why is it women really didn't have any rights? They were just assumed to be married off back then. And it wouldn't take reporters long to figure out that their line of questioning wasn't that far off. And it didn't take them long to dig up the gossip on Dorothy, that the Arnold family, they had done a pretty well job at keeping it covered up. So back in September of 1910, Dorothy had a rendezvous with a 30-year-old man she had previously met while attending Bryn Mawr College, and she was romantically involved with him as she was in college, and she continued this relationship. And his name was George Griscom Jr. He preferred to go by Junior, and that's what I'm going to keep referring to him from here on out, just because it makes my life a whole lot easier. Junior was from a wealthy Pennsylvania family himself. That September, Dorothy had lied to her parents, saying that she was going to visit former college classmates in Boston. She wasn't with her classmates. She was with Junior, and she had pawned $500 worth of jewelry to fund their week-long affair. Holy shit, that's like pawning $16,000 worth of your jewelry now. I don't know. I don't have $16,000 worth of jewelry. Probably many of you don't either. Well, the Arnolds, Dorothy's parents, they found out about this, and they were pissed. And Francis, he put his foot down and he forbid Dorothy from gallivanting with Junior. But you really think that stopped her? Absolutely not. They secretly continued their relationship through letters and stuff. And the last time they'd seen each other was in early November, before Junior, he was to go on an extended vacation with his parents to Florence, Italy, and that allegedly Francis' statement to the press was actually in regards to Junior. He did not think highly of him at all. And since they knew about this, and the Arnolds knew that Junior was on vacation in Italy, they actually, before the press conference, they had already sent off a telegram on the 16th of December, just 4 days after Dorothy had gone missing, to Junior. And when he just... So they sent the telegram to Junior, and they were demanding information on Dorothy's whereabouts. And Junior, he returned his own telegram, denying knowing anything about Dorothy's whereabouts or even any knowledge of her disappearance. Well, this response didn't sit well with the Arnold family, and in early January, Mary and Dorothy's big brother John, they were on a big old ship to Italy to forcibly get information out of Junior. At the Anglo-American Hotel, the two met Junior in his room and demanded he give them information about Dorothy. But Junior insisted he knew nothing about where or what may have happened to Dorothy. John and Mary went as far as demanding that Junior give them the letters that Dorothy had written him in secrecy, which he did, and he had no problem handing those over. But when John and Mary got the letters, they discovered there was nothing in there that would help them, and John claims that he allegedly destroyed the letters later. In February of 1911, Junior returned to the United States, and he told the press that once Dorothy was found, he had intentions to marry her with her mother's approval. Well, obviously that wasn't going to happen, and Mary even told reporters that she would never approve such a union. Reporters also reported that month that the hotel that Junior was staying at, that clerks had seen him talking to a veiled woman that they believed to be Dorothy. The woman seemed greatly agitated, and the two of them were having an earnest talk that the staff was unable to hear. So other than body language, how can you tell if somebody's having an earnest talk if you can't hear them? Over the next months, Junior spent thousands of dollars on ads in major newspapers asking Dorothy to just please come home. The NYPD obviously really didn't want to do any real work, since at the end of January, they believed Dorothy was still alive and that she'd eventually come back home on her own. But the Arnold family felt differently. Not everybody in that family feels this way, but Francis had told reporters that he and his family believed that Dorothy was attacked and killed in Central Park on her way home, and then was thrown into the Central Park Reservoir. Personally, I'm thinking maybe she was attacked and killed in Central Park too, but I don't think she was thrown in the reservoir. I'm not really sure where she went. And Francis claimed that he had two clues that confirmed his suspicion, but never disclosed what they were to the public. The NYPD, they dismissed his theory since the temps on the 12th of December, they were at 21 degrees Fahrenheit, and the reservoir had already been frozen solid. But they did do a search of Central Park, and when the reservoir thawed, they searched the water, but they didn't find anything. Yet they did distribute circulars of a physical description, information about the reward, and a picture of Dorothy throughout the U.S., Canada, and Mexico. The New York Times covered the story almost daily, and with the circulars and the Times coverage, investigators received many calls from all over the U.S. of people claiming to have seen Dorothy. With every one of these tips, they did follow-ups, but each call and every follow-up turned up to be a false lead. The Arnold family even received 2 ransom notes from kidnappers demanding $5,000 for Dorothy's safe return. Guess what? Yep, you guessed it. Each one of those was a hoax too. They also received a postmarked postcard from New York City to the Arnold family home, and it was a handwritten. The handwriting actually did match Dorothy's, and it had read, "I am safe," and then it was signed Dorothy. But Francis didn't believe this was from Dorothy herself, but felt that it was more of a cruel joke from someone who had copied handwriting samples that were featured in the newspaper. And at the same time as the postcard came, a San Francisco jeweler claimed he had seen and engraved a diamond wedding ring for Dorothy on January 7th with the inscription, "To AJA from ERB, December 10, 1910. Those dates and initials just don't add up. Now, do they? She didn't go missing until the 12th, so how was she getting allegedly married on the 10th. And those initials, they don't match anything of hers. So in early spring of 1911, NYPD finally decided that they no longer believed Dorothy was going to be coming home on her own. And now they had believed that she was deceased, which is a contradiction to what the New York City Deputy Police Commissioner William J. Flynn states. He stated that now seems the only reasonable way of looking at the case. The girl has been missing for 75 days, and in all that time, not a single clue has been found that was worth the name. We have no evidence that a crime has been committed, and the case is now one of a missing persons and nothing more. Police continued to investigate reports of sightings, but led to finding... So my question is, how can the NYPD believe that she's deceased, but there's no evidence of a crime, and now that she's just a missing persons and nothing more? So, but they ended up basically closing the case, but any lead that came in, they would still investigate, but everything came up as dead ends. So, obviously, at this time, the rumor mill and the theories, of course, would have to begin. Heaven forbid humans would just let humans grieve. It just doesn't happen. So, here, onto the theories. The first theory is that Dorothy slipped on an icy sidewalk and hit her head and had total amnesia. But remember that Keith Pinkerton and the NYPD had all checked the hospitals, and no one with Dorothy's description matched anyone that had come in with a concussion. The second theory, I am going to give a trigger warning about suicide. So if you're not comfortable with this, I'm sorry, but I'm going to be referencing it for multiple times until the end of this story. If you want to skip ahead to the last probably 15 seconds of the story where I give you the little info announcement that I want to give you, go right ahead. I am sorry. So theories 2 and 3, it is the same theory that Dorothy had committed suicide, but they're for two different reasons. The first one of these theories of 2 and 3, I guess it'd be the second theory, is Junior had gotten a letter from Dorothy saying how disappointed she was in herself for another rejected story from McClure's magazine, and had alluded to suicidal things, stating, well, the story, which was the poinsettia and the flame, has come back. McClure's has turned me down. Failure stares me in the face. All I can see ahead is a long road with no turning. Mother will always think an accident has happened. And then, number 3, the suicide theory was also believed by some of the family members and friends of Dorothy's. But their belief that she committed suicide had little to do with the rejections from her writings, but rather that her relationship with Junior was faltering. And of course, the New York paper only manifested this theory by reporting that Junior's own cousin, Andrew Griscom, had jumped to his death off an ocean liner when he was forbidden to marry an English governess. Of course, the papers would have to manifest things and make more than need to be out of it. And obviously, Junior and Dorothy's relationship wasn't really faltering. They were just keeping it secret. So theory number 4, rumors had spread that Dorothy had fallen pregnant and was going to have an abortion that ended up being botched and she died on the table, then was secretly either buried or cremated. Well, the credibility of this rumor was fueled in early April 1916 when a clinic operating out of a basement of a home in Bellevue, Pennsylvania, was raided by police for operating an illegal abortion clinic where the doctors, Dr. H.E. Lutz and Dr. Meredith, were performing these abortions. Many of the women had ended up having complications after their abortion and had died on the table, where these two, basically, after the woman died on the table, they tossed him in the furnace to burn. Well, probably trying to save his own ass, Lutz testified, "I am not giving him the time or day or the acknowledgement of him being a doctor. I just think these two are assholes." Well, so in order to save his own ass, Lutz testified to the New York DA that Dr. Meredith, only time I'm going to be referring to him as doctor, performed the abortion, and Dorothy died of complications on the table, where she ended up being just another one of the bodies that they would toss into the furnace. The DA, he actually believed this story, but when he told Francis Arnold, Francis stated, saying that he thought the story was ridiculous and absolutely untrue. So remember John S. Keith? Well, 2 months after Dorothy disappeared, he got a tip from a Pittsburgh attorney saying that Dorothy was in a local sanitarium. But when Keith and two of his investigators investigated the lead, it led to a woman who was not Dorothy. And then, so Theory 5 goes along with Theory 4, but instead of Dorothy being just another body thrown in a furnace, Edward Glenorris was a convicted felon in Rhode Island in April of 1916. He alleged that he was paid $250 to bury a body in December of 1910. So his buddy, Little Louie, had hired him to drive a woman from a home in New Rochelle to West Point, New York. Glenorris met these two men, and one was known as Doc, and the other one came off as a wealthy and well-dressed man, according to Glenorris. Kind of gives me Burke and Hare vibes, but that's just me. While they were driving, Little Louie looks at Glenorris, and he's basically like, "Hey, you know who that is?" He's like, "It's the body of that chick, Dorothy Arnold." Glenorris even stated that he recognized Dorothy by the signet ring that she wore on her left hand. A signet ring is a ring that has an emblem in it, and they were used to, like, I think you put ink on it and then you'd stamp a letter, almost like an old-fashioned notarization, but not a legal notarization, a notarization saying, "Hey, this was me that actually sent this." The next day, Little Louie and Glenorris went to finish the job. When the two returned back to New Rochelle, Glenorris claimed they wrapped the body in a sheet and buried it in a cellar. Glenorris had actually told this story to the prison warden, and the prison warden, he's the one who reported it to the correct authorities. And the correct authorities, they followed up on this claim, and they excavated several homes in that area, but they found no human remains. Francis, however, he never believed a word of what Glenorris had said, and after no remains were found, Glenorris kind of looked like an idiot to the reporters. For years to follow, alleged sightings of Dorothy would still come in to the authorities, and each one they investigated, but each one turned out to be a false, and the family would still receive letters claiming to be Dorothy. All were proven to be false. One of those letters even came from an attorney in California claiming that Dorothy was now living as Ella Nevis in LA. Francis disputed that claim pretty quick. He didn't believe it one bit. Things quieted down for a few years. Then attention was brought to the case once again on April 8th, 1921, when Captain John H. Ayers of the Bureau of Missing Persons claimed that Dorothy's fate was known to the Bureau and the family for some time, but refused to elaborate whether or not Dorothy was dead or alive. After he realized what he said, the next day, he claimed he was misquoted and denied knowing the fate of Dorothy. Cover your own ass, right? In the weeks that followed Dorothy's disappearance, her father, Francis, had spent around $250,000 trying to locate his daughter, even though he believed that she was kidnapped and murdered on the day she disappeared on her way home through Central Park. So that $250,000 that Francis spent in the weeks following Dorothy's disappearance, in today's time, that's like roughly around $8 million, which also means that $5,000 that the alleged kidnappers were asking for ransom is actually around $160,000 today, just to give you an idea of what we now sit here and look at to what they were asking for then. So $250,000 today, $250,000, okay. If you've got it, you've got it. Not too many of us do. Is now in another 100 years, our $250,000 is going to be near $8 million, and 1911, $250,000 in another 100 years, which will be 200-year gap. My calculation is going to be around $16 million. Anyway, so when Francis passed away on April 6, 1922, he had left nothing to Dorothy in his will. He stated that he was satisfied that she was not alive. While Francis believed that Dorothy had been murdered, her mother, Mary, didn't agree with her husband. Remember when I said not everyone in the Arnold family believed she was kidnapped and murdered? Well, her mother, Mary, is the one that didn't agree. She actually believed, or she wanted to believe, that Dorothy was still alive. Mary ended up passing away on December 29th, 1928, 6 years after her husband, and she held on to hope that Dorothy was still alive. There was an excerpt in an obituary for Mary in the United Press Associations that referenced the hunt for Dorothy as, you guys are going to love this, the really great search of the age, than one that did much to develop modern newspaper police coverage. None of that makes any sense, to me anyway. It's giving me the vibes that the newspaper's trying to say that the police did such a great job doing the coverage, but I'm taking it more the newspaper did the police's job, but even they could only do so much. After Mary's death, remember that family lawyer? Well, John S. Keith, he ended up going public stating that he believed that Dorothy had committed suicide due to a failing writing career. So what really happened to Dorothy on her way home from shopping for a dress that she never purchased? Was she kidnapped and murdered like Francis Arnold believed till the day he died? Had she committed suicide over a failed writing career like some of her family and Mr. Keith believed? Or a failing relationship that wasn't failing at all, but it wasn't up to Daddy's standards? Did she end up boarding an ocean liner only to jump off the side like her boyfriend's cousin Andrew Griscom? Did she take off, have an abortion, and it went sour and took her life and was just tossed into a furnace? Or transported by little Louie and Glenoris only to be wrapped in a sheet and buried in a cellar that they dug up that they couldn't find? Or did she just disappear, and the letters that the Arnold family was receiving from Dorothy saying she was really safe from her? Is Dorothy the original Gone Girl, as she's been known as? Now, you're probably wondering what those updates I have for you are. So, all of you true crime devotees, starting on June 15th and the 15th of each month, I will be doing an extra episode those weeks that will be including more recent missing persons things. It's probably going to be a list of missing persons that'll be anywhere between 5 to 15, possibly 20, depending on the information I have. And they're going to be primarily like FBI flyer information. And if there is more information out there, and it'll probably be it'll probably just be vague details, if any of them are available. So keep an eye out for what I'm going to be referring to as mid-month missing. Let's Tell Their Story is on most platforms that you listen to. We're on YouTube, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Castaway. There's a whole list of them. If you go to the Facebook page, Let's Tell Our Story, the whole list is on there. So wherever you do listen to this, it would be it means so much if you could leave like a 5-star review or write a positive review. It'll help get Let's Tell Their Story out there for more true crime devotees to hear and find us. If you do feel you have something negative to say, please feel free to email me at letstelltheirstory@gmail.com. You can also send in an email if you have a case suggestion that you would like me to do. So my true crime devotees, you guys have a great day, and I will be talking to you again next week.